Overclockers, my name's Bryony, and in this Overclockers Academy video, I'm going to give you the complete guide to RAM and help you choose your PC memory. I'm going to cover the various aspects of choosing the right PC memory, and it's actually more complicated than you might think. I know that I've learned a hell of a lot while planning this video, so a huge shout out to Demolition, who works in our tech department, for giving me a hand with this one. We're going to dive into why you need to consider compatibility, capacity, speed, and overclocking to get the performance that you've paid for, particularly with DDR5 memory. If there's any words that I happen to use in the video that not really sure what they might mean, I'll make sure to put an explanation in the description below, along with all the different links and things that I think you might find useful. To begin choosing your RAM upgrade, I'm going to explain what speed, timings, and latency are and how this relates to performance. The RAM's clock speed is usually listed in megahertz. However, mega transfers is technically the correct term, but it is calculated at a 1-to-1 ratio. This is the speed in which your RAM can access data from the CPU. The higher the clock speed, the more data your RAM can process per second. Also listed is the transfer rate, which is measured in megabytes per second. This is calculated by multiplying the RAM speed by the width of the I/O bus. This determines the maximum possible transfer rate. Now moving on to RAM timings, which are also very important when selecting which RAM kit to use. The usual way of displaying this is a list of 4 numbers, such as 36, 36, 36, 76. Now let's break down what each of these means. The first number is CAS latency, CL, which is how quickly it takes the RAM to have the data ready. The second number is row column delay, TRCD. This is how long it takes for the RAM to read the data. The third number is row pre-charge time, TRP, the time it takes for a new row of data to be ready. The fourth number is row archive time, TRAS, the minimum time it takes for a row to be active. While a higher data rate usually has a greater impact on measured performance, optimally timed memory kits can often outperform poorly timed kits. Therefore, look for low latency as well as high speed. To work out the latency of a memory kit, multiply the CAS latency by 2000 and then times it by the data rate. The lower the time in nanoseconds, the faster the RAM is. For example, a kit of 6000 MHz with a CL of 30 would look like this. Now, this is obviously only a very basic overview when it comes to the wonderfully scientific world of PC memory, but I will link to a few articles in the description below where you can find out more and really dive into all the nitty-gritty. However, let's move on to how this comes into play when buying memory for your PC. When it comes to choosing memory, you might assume that what you see is what you get. You found the kit that you want and surely you just plug it in and it's going to work. However, when purchasing a kit of RAM, it is important to know that the ratings listed in the specifications are only related to the actual kit. It doesn't take into account your other hardware or other memory. For example, 2 separate kits rated at 6000 MHz each are not rated for that speed when combined. That speed is solely for what you get in the individual package, even if they are the same SKU, the same speed, and bought at the same time. It's likely that they're still going to work perfectly fine, but they've never been tested together and therefore not rated for that speed when combined. It's always best to buy a kit with the intended amount of RAM sticks rather than upgrading later. However, there is often a trade-off, and you'll need to decide whether you want to go for speed, capacity, or somewhere in between to ensure that you don't run into any stability issues. This is why you'll notice that most professional overclocking boards only come with 2 DIMM lanes for memory. The answer is speed. This brings us nicely into the next part of the video, which is capacity versus speed. You want to consider your workload before choosing. Typically, you'll want speed for gaming and capacity for workstation tasks. Speed, cache latency, module size, and module quantity all need to be balanced in order to avoid running into problems, and you should definitely consider these factors before purchasing. In most scenarios, particularly gaming, 32 gigabytes is plenty, with only 16 gigabytes or even 8 gigabytes recommended in many games. And there are advantages to running RAM with high-rated speeds. Although it won't have as much of an effect as upgrading the processor or graphics card, fast memory can improve your FPS and overall performance. It's worth sacrificing speed for higher capacity when it comes to workload-related tasks, such as rendering, video or image editing, or even automation or simulation. In this scenario, while speed would also improve performance, it's generally going to be better to go for a much higher capacity. For example, you might want to run 64 gigs of RAM at 5600 MHz, but it might not be stable. This is when you would reduce the speed in increments until you find the sweet spot for your particular system. When it comes to speed, latency, and capacity, you might be saying, why can't I have it all? If you want no compromises, then you're going to need a really big budget with a high-end motherboard, knowledge of overclocking, and a good amount of patience, with a lot of luck from the silicon lottery, which I'm going to mention later. As I mentioned at the start of the video, it's always better to buy just one kit of memory with your intended number of RAM sticks. These kits are available in single, dual, or quad channel configurations. Dual channel kits perform better than single channel, as the memory has 2 lanes to operate at once, without needing to wait for the previous request to complete. With a quad channel kit of RAM, you also need to take into consideration whether the CPU and the motherboard that you have can actually support this. The same thing goes for octo channel. Finally, it's worth mentioning that dual channel isn't defined by how many sticks you have. For example, a single stick of DDR4 will run in single channel, whereas a single stick of DDR5 will run in dual channel. Module quantity and capacity are both factors that, when increased, will add to the instability of your PC. And if you're building or upgrading a PC with DDR5 memory, for most use cases, I'd recommend sticking to just 2 sticks. Installing 4 sticks can have a huge impact on the maximum frequency you're going to be able to reach. You'll notice that at Overclockers UK, we currently only stock DDR5 kits of 2 sticks or install just 2 sticks in our high-end systems. EXPO also only ships in kits of 2 due to the limitations with AMD CPUs, and although it's possible to find kits with 4 sticks of DDR5, they come at a higher price point and they're often not stocked due to being so niche. You may or may not have heard of the silicon lottery when it comes to your CPU, especially when it comes to the capabilities of the CPU itself. Well, this also applies to the IMC. This is the integrated memory controller, and it's very important to check your CPU specifications when choosing PC memory, because the IMC, which is inside your CPU, affects the RAM compatibility, speed, and capacity. For example, the i9-3900KS only officially supports up to a maximum speed of 5600 megatransfers or 5600 megahertz, less if more slots are populated. Meanwhile, the Ryzen 7 7800X3D only officially supports up to 5200 megatransfers or 3600 megatransfers if 4 slots are populated. This is very important to know when looking at higher speed RAM kits, and it's also a cause for confusion and potentially frustration when it comes to achieving those higher speeds. And understandably so, because this isn't something that's listed as a disclaimer anywhere. Let's say you've just spent a lot of money on a nice DDR5 kit that is rated at 7800 MHz. Without being told or learning the hard way, you'd expect to be able to apply XMP or EXPO and the system is just going to work at that speed. Well, that's only a third of the story. You are technically overclocking your memory, and you also need to consider your motherboard and the CPU. Your RAM is rated for 7800 MHz, but your IMC or your motherboard might not be rated to that speed. It's worth checking your motherboard's memory QVL or qualified vendors list provided by the motherboard manufacturer. It's going to include all of the tested and definitely supported memory module brands or models that are guaranteed to work on a certain motherboard with a certain CPU. Additionally, someone else might have shared online that they're using the same CPU that you've got, the same motherboard and memory, and it is perfectly stable. But each CPU is different. You need to essentially win the silicon lottery or somehow obtain a golden sample to run memory at such high speeds. This leads us nicely onto XMP, DOCP, EOCP, and EXPO. I won't go into loads of detail about RAM overclocking, but what you need to know is that these profiles are essentially presets. They change the voltages, timings, subtiming, and more importantly, the speed. This is technically overclocking, so make sure you check your hardware warranties beforehand. XMP is a standard that was created by Intel. It means extreme memory profile, whereas DOCP or EOCP means direct or extended overclocking profile. This is essentially an XMP alternative tuned for AMD chipsets. Then we have EXPO, which is extended profiles for overclocking. This is designed for use with AMD processors. All high-performance RAM uses these profiles. This is because they all run above the standard DDR industry specifications. If you don't enable the setting in your BIOS, they are going to run at stock speeds. That means that if you want your memory to run at the advertised speed, the relevant setting will need to be enabled in your motherboard BIOS. However, anytime overclocking is involved, there is a risk of instability. No automatic configuration can account for outside factors, such as your CPU overclock, the type of motherboard you have, etc., etc. This is something to keep in mind if you do experience any problems, and you should consider manually adjusting the memory frequency to be slightly lower if you do experience any issues. You can check that your memory is running at the correct speed using the free application CPU-Z or in Windows Task Manager. If the operating memory frequency matches the XMP or EXPO speed that's listed on the memory kit, then it's successfully enabled. Just remember, if your RAM is showing half the speed, you do need to multiply it by 2 because it's double data rate. The most important thing to remember is that even though your RAM is rated for a particular speed, it doesn't mean that it's always going to run and be stable at that speed. Finally, if you're not just choosing your PC memory, but upgrading your existing memory, then you might have considered adding more sticks of RAM. Unfortunately, it's not as simple as just downloading it. As I have already mentioned, ideally you would buy a single kit, particularly when it comes to DDR5 memory, as you can often run into stability issues when you're using more than 2 sticks. If you do happen to upgrade later, you'll want to make sure that you have the same model name and number with the same speed and timings, but also ideally the same version number and a very similar serial number. You can check this on the sticker on the back of your memory. However, not all manufacturers actually list every specification. This isn't to say that they're not going to work together, but do expect instabilities, especially when applying a RAM profile. If you bought 2 kits at the same time. It is possible that you could get 2 kits that are very close together within the hundreds of maybe thousands of each other. But ultimately, the further you get away from each other, the more likely you're going to have some stability or performance issues. If you want to know how to physically install your new RAM modules, do make sure to check out our dedicated how-to video. In conclusion, when it comes to choosing your memory, you'll need to make sure that it's compatible with both your CPU and your motherboard. Check the QVL list for your motherboard and read through your processor's specification list. You'll also need to decide whether you want to prioritize speed or capacity, and consider the possibility that even if you do pay for a very high speed rated memory kit, it might not necessarily be stable at that speed on your personal system. Choosing the right PC memory ensures optimal system performance, and hopefully this guide is going to give you enough of an overview to make sure that you get the correct memory and you have years of happy PC gaming working, etc. And also get, of course, the performance that you're expecting to have or what you've paid for. However, if you're still unsure, please don't hesitate to ask any questions you might have in the comments section below. I'm going to do my best to answer them. And of course, give this video a big thumbs up if you found this video helpful, and hit subscribe to catch our upcoming content. And I'll see you again in the next one.